Thank you for coming today. My name is Aram Hur. I'm the director of the Center for International Studies, professor of political science. And I want to welcome you to another meeting of our still relatively our still relatively new global research and policy seminar. It's a new series that tries to address current challenges in global development and governance and to explore innovative policy approaches and provide expert insights on emerging international trends. And we hope that these events will promote interdisciplinary dialogue and critical analysis and bridge theoretical knowledge, empirical insights, and practical solutions. Today, I'm really delighted to welcome Professor Aram Hur, MIT in CIS. Professor Hur is the Kim Koo Chair in Korean Studies, and she is Assistant Professor of Political Science at the Fletcher School over at Tufts University. So it wasn't too far for her to come today, but really great to have her. Her research focuses on nationalism and democracy with special attention to issues of identity, integration, democratic support in East Asia. She has a terrific and impressive background. And if you're interested in learning more, please visit her website, because I always find it's a little boring to go through the list of books and articles, but she has many and they're really worth your time. Today, she's speaking to us about the timely and important topic that has made her own past research so critical, which is how nationalist polarization threatens democracy, lessons from South Korea. So please join me in welcoming Professor Aram Hur.
Thank you. So I was like South Korea, I got lost coming here. And so if I sound a little bit out of breath, it's just because I was running down Memorial Drive like a crazy person. Okay, so today I want to talk about what's happening in South Korea, but with the broader perspective of what kinds of democratic lessons could be learned from the South Korean case. So in early December of last year, as you all probably know, South Korea's President Yoon Suk-yeol declared martial law, citing threat from pro-North Korea anti-state forces. This was the first time since the last time in 1980 that South Korea was under martial law, nearly a full decade before it democratized. Swift action by the National Assembly overturned the martial law decree within about 6 hours. But since then, the democratic crisis has really spiraled. Within a little bit more than a month, the acting president was swapped out 3 times. And the country remains bitterly divided and gripped in political protest. I was thinking maybe that today the Constitutional Court would come out with the ruling on the impeachment case, which would have made this timing so interesting, but we're still waiting with bated breath. Now, in the aftermath of what happened, there were various kind of assessments coming out of the media and the policy circles that this was the reverse January 6th, how South Koreans help lawmakers scale parliament to save democracy, how South Korea's democracy saved itself, and South Korea's democracy survived. Finally, how polarization undermines democracy in South Korea. Now, I'm sharing these snippets with you to show you that there's been somewhat contradicting assessments of what has actually happened. Now, the starting point for my talk today is that in order to adjudicate between these different assessments and also to figure out what broader lessons about democracy we should take away from the South Korean case, that we first need to accurately characterize what South Korean democracy is the case of. And so South Korea is probably most well known as the shining success story of third wave democratization. But, as this recent crisis has shown, and as well as other instances of democratic backsliding across the world, right, successful democratization doesn't equate or ensure successful democracy. But in the post-World War II liberal order, the focus was very much on the developmental factors that predicted successful democratic transitions. After the mass-scale horrors by autocratic regimes during World War II, the idea here was that any shade of democracy was better than none. And democracy export really became the dominant US foreign policy goal. Now, in that sea, Dagbert Rustow was probably one of the exceptions in that early wave of democratization scholars to explicitly think about how the genesis of democracy links to things like the function of democracy. And in his theory of dynamic theory of democratic transitions, he singled out national unity as the necessary background condition. And the idea was not that democracy would solve political conflict, but that in fact it is born out and brings out constant political conflict. And that national unity was the thing that even in the face of intense internal disagreements, that would still bind that conflict within the realms of what he describes as a hot family feud. We've all been in one, super intense, but still somehow comes back to some fundamental rules of the game, right? That national unity was going to be that glue. And seen from that nationalist lens, South Korea is not a success case, but in fact, a case of democratization that violates this background condition. Because it was a democracy that transitioned amidst and even driven by intense nationalist division and conflict instead of national unity. And South Korea is not unique here. There are many third wave democracies, post-colonial, coming out of recently gaining national independence, trying to figure out who are we, but under intense, usually either security pressures or pressures to modernize and catch up with the West. That's a story that's actually shared by many third wave cases. Now, from this framework, I want to argue today that the martial law episode in South Korea is not an aberration or even a sudden reversal in an otherwise very well-functioning democracy, but that it is actually the symptom of systemic weakness. Now, if you look a little bit closer at South Korea as well as Taiwan, the East Asian third waves, they suffer from this sort of curious paradox. So generally, they score relatively high on various democracy indices. I'm showing you freedom scores right now, but I'll also show you what this looks like in VDEM. But kind of against the backdrop of those high scores, they have had long-standing cyclical illiberal forms of partisan competition. There's a not so funny saying in South Korean politics that when you get elected president, you should go straight to jail because every single former president has either served time in jail or committed suicide in the process of being investigated to imprison. Right, so we see with every partisan turnover, especially in both cases, but I'm going to focus on South Korea today, of these retribution and purge cycles with every partisan turnover. These are things like stacking the deck to prosecute the other side, changing electoral campaign laws to really stem or stymie opposition leaders from rising to power, political gridlock with the legislature, as well as sort of strategic kind of behind the scenes suppression of opposition civil society. So these things have always kind of coexisted with these strangely relatively high democratic quality scores. At not just the absolute score that places like South Korea and Taiwan get, but actually look at how that score over time, you start to see an interesting pattern here. Okay, this is coming from the VDEM index. What you see is that over time, both democracies kind of hit a plateau. There's still more room here, both in Taiwan and in South Korea, to continue to go higher, but it is at a relatively high level, but there is still evidence of stagnation in quality nonetheless. That's interesting. Why is that? So in an article in Comparative Political Studies published last year, before actually any of the South Korea's current crisis began, my co-author Andrew Yeo at Brookings and I, we named this phenomenon democratic ceilings. It's the phenomenon of sort of hitting a ceiling in terms of deepening of democratic quality. We're totally borrowing here, obviously, from the glass ceiling metaphor. And we argue that some democracies have kind of these cyclical and endemic barriers to continued progress, and particularly sort of the deepening democratic. So for South Korea, where does that kind of ceiling effect or barrier come from? An argument was that it actually is rooted in the way that South Korean democracy first came to be. Amidst intense national conflict, under also intense security pressures from an unresolved Korean War, the Civil War for Korea, as well as the ideological shadows and pressures of the ongoing Cold War. So Korea is generally understood as a racially, ethnically homogeneous nation, and that's true definitionally. But at the political elite level, there has been intense division over how to best lead that Korean nation that goes even before independence, even back to during the Japanese colonial era, and if you really want to be technical, even before that. So there's always been this sort of internal division of how to best lead the Korean nation, especially against sort of the rising West. And post-war, there emerged sort of a northern faction that really embraced and doubled down on this idea of an ethno-nationalist and self-reliant Korean nation, that was the only way to sort of redeem the nation from the past of colonialism. Whereas there emerged also a southern faction that embraced the idea of a more modernized Korea, embedded in the international system, part of this, what it thought to be this emerging Western-based liberal order. Those two factions become, as Korea becomes a flashpoint in the Cold War, become aligned with the communist Soviet forces in the north, the United States in the south, and the two sides fight a bitter 3-year civil war where essentially kin are killing kin. Now, I want to start sort of at the top row here and work down. What happens after the armistice, right? And so it's an armistice, the war is not over, so the security pressure is still is there as an overhang. Within South Korea, where the southern faction is now the ruling government, its primary threat to national survival is what? A potential another attack north, right? And so what it does is it brutally persecutes any remaining northern loyalists or suspected communist sympathizers as threats to the nation and national dissidents, right? And this persecution is, very specific. And what it does is that it essentially seeds the boundaries of a nationalist cleavage within South Korea. Now, as we move to the democratization phase, public grievances, it's an authoritarian regime, right? So even though it had massive developmental success, public grievances to the authoritarian regime started to grow, and the underground national dissidents see opportunity. So what do? They merge forces with various factions, various pro-democracy factions. And because of the years that they spent having to be underground and networking and developing modes of communication, they actually quickly rise to be a core faction of the pro-democracy movement. What's important here is to understand that the primary reason why the national dissident group is asking and pushing for democracy is not because democracy is necessarily an end, right? Because it is a powerful means for them, for them to enter now legitimately as a competing political party into the power. It's important to understand why they were part of the pro-democracy movement. I'm obviously not saying that everybody who voted democracy movement were motivated by those intentions, but a core faction was. And what that does in the consolidation phase is that the emergent party system, right, becomes polarized, and they organize and define themselves around the most prominent social cleavage of that time, which in South Korea is this nationalist cleavage. Okay? And so what you get is, the conservatives, who are the authoritarian successor party, embracing sort of this global Korea vision, and then the opposition progressives, right, that were rooted in a lot of the national dissident factions, embracing sort of this one Korea vision that's much more pro-engagement with North Korea and kind of suspicious of too much U.S. intervention. So in that article, we call this nationalist polarization when political parties are polarized on mutually exclusive nationalist visions. Nationalist polarization is not just a more intense form of polarization. This is sort of the gripe that I have with arguments out there that it's, everything is polarization. I think it's partly true. But nationalist polarization is sort of categorically unique. It's not just, hey, it's more intense polarization. It's actually polarization that's based on a specific national identity axis. And that's what, in our minds, makes it uniquely damaging to democracy. So I'm going to spell this out. Why is that, right? Because nationalisms are kind of inherently state-seeking. What I mean by that is a nation, I just taught my national course this morning, so this feels very, very familiar. A nation is what? Not rhetorical question. A nation is a political community that is, that sees itself as deserving of and also desires some form of self-rule, usually in the form of ownership of its own state. Not always, but usually. And it's that state-seeking nature of nationalism that distinguishes it from even other identity-based cleavages like class or race or even religion, although religion has a high propensity to become a nationalist cleavage. And when political parties in a democracy are consumed by such nationalist goals, it fundamentally distorts the goals of the democratic game. It redefines the end of democratic competition from something like policy, representation, or improvement to what? To state capture. Right? And so once you get into power, the primary agenda of the party is to reform the state in the vision of its nationhood, right? And that leads to behaviors that explicitly violate things like forbearance. It also reframes the political opposition from the other side that you may not like all the time and maybe intensely disagree with, still respect as a valid player in the game, to something that is an existential threat to your party's nationalist vision that needs to be eliminated, right? This is I know I'm talking about South Korea, but this is gonna sound quite familiar to what is now happening in American politics. That explicitly leads to behaviors that violate mutual tolerance. These are obviously the two sort of what Levitsky and Ziblatt kind of identifies the two informal guardrails, kind of the keepers of democratic norms, if you will, of democracies. So the takeaway here is that nationalist polarization is detrimental at any stage of democracy, but is especially bad when it's sort of baked in from the very beginning, as it was in South. It incentivizes and even sometimes mandates rank and file party members to behave as partisans first, or nationalists first, and then Democrats with a small d last, right? It breeds a distinctly illiberal flavor of partisan competition that actively inhibits the habituation of democratic norms. And the tricky thing here is that as party elites compete with each other in these ways, the citizenry also starts to sort of mimic that flavor. South Korea has had 2 now presidential impeachment cases almost. And you might say that that's that's the sign of a strong democracy, but to me, that's a sign of a weak one. That presidential impeachment is there at the last resort, right? It goes there when all other forms of democratic deliberation have failed. So the public also starts to mimic sort of the zero-sum, zero tolerance type of posture to its democratic leaders. And finally, nationalist polarization, perhaps most importantly, actively and deliberately seeks to eliminate a real political opposition and a fair playing field. And these are the 2 things. This is the final line that Levitsky and Wei in their Foreign Affairs piece argue separates democracies from descending into various shapes of competitive experience. Right? So in those ways, nationalist polarization is uniquely dangerous. So if you follow the story so far, right, then the question is not so much, oh my goodness, why did this happen in South Korea? But oh my goodness, how does South Korean democracy keep it together then for this long, right? Why did something like martial law happen at this particular moment? And here I really want to talk a little bit about why it broke down now, and it has a lot to do with the shifting partisan landscape within South Korea, and particularly the rapid rise of the left, which for a long time has been sort of the political underdog in South Korean politics. So the conservatives, the authoritarian successor party, were really the long dominant force. They were the authoritarian legacy party, but that authoritarian regime had yielded impressive, miraculous developmental achievements, right? So that was a huge sort of party brand edge that it had. Meanwhile, the left was always kind of crippled from the start because of these associations of being communist and et cetera. There's a sort of derogatory term in South Korean politics to refer to the left as 빨갱이, which is basically the Reds. So that association in sort of the public psyche is still very strong. So that really inhibited the left from behaving like a typical leftist party elsewhere, right? It couldn't be the party of state-led intervention, because that's what the conservatives have done. It had to be very careful with pushing too hard on a nationalist agenda because of fear of being accused as being communist. And so the conservatives had all of the resources, the political legacy, and the actual campaign network, as well as financial backing from the chaebols. These are the big Korean conglomerates that the authoritarian regime supported during the developmental era. So it had all of that. So even though it had lost a few presidencies after some catastrophic performance failures, it was long seen as the dominant force. That starts to shift in the aftermath of the Asian financial crisis in '97. So in Korea, the Asian financial crisis is better known as the IMF crisis, partly because IMF was the international regulatory agency that came in, but also because IMF became an acronym for I am fired. Right? As a result of the forced and rapid market liberalization that followed the Asian financial crisis, certain domestic sectors were entirely decimated. Many, with the whole sort of corporate downsizing and restructuring, many Koreans lost jobs that were supposed to be lifelong career jobs. Right? And what this started to do, and again, this is not a uniquely South Korean story, it's sort of a, sort of the shadow of liberal order story here, right? Is that it started to widen inequality, started to really put a damper on the tremendous social mobility that was witnessed during the big developmental push upwards. Right. And what it did was it kind of sowed growing public disillusion with the conservative nationalist agenda. Right. It led to this sort of pervasive belief that, we haven't really joined the liberal order, but we've actually kind of succumbed to it. And that kind of sentiment, growing sort of disillusion or disappointment, at least with the conservatives, hits a watershed moment with the 2016 impeachment of Park Geun-hye. Park Geun-hye was not any ordinary president. She is the daughter of Park Chung-hee, the military dictator during the developmental era. And she's really sort of the living symbol of South Korean conservatism. And so when she's impeached in 2016 over various corruption charges, and we saw, the candlelight movement in South Korea where millions of citizens really poured out, it wasn't just about the corruption charges. It was sort of reflective of a growing public disillusion with the conservatives. And it's on the heels of that in 2017 that Moon Jae-in from the leftist Democratic Party, the opposition party, comes into power. Now, again, the left had won presidency before, but never with this level of popular mandate and also moral high ground. And the Moon administration pursues the leftist nationalist agenda with a palpably different aggression. I mean, he single-handedly revives relations with North Korea by holding 3 inter-Korea summits within a year, directly with Kim Jong-un. There's not really a precedent for that frequency of engagement with North Korea. He sort of, actively weakens the relationship with Japan that had been built before by instigating trade wars, nullifying the comfort women deal that was struck right before he came into power, et cetera. And these are very consistent with sort of that one Korea vision, and starts to exact retribution to the conservatives using the same blueprint that the conservatives had long used against the left, right? And so, when an existential threat is sort of across the neighborhood, right? It's not as threatening, but when it shows up at your door, banging down on the door, it can trigger a fight or flight response, right? And I think it's important to see the timing of South Korea's crisis within the context of this sort of really rapid crescendo of the left. Now, this isn't to somehow justify or exonerate Yoon from anything. And certainly there are, a host of sort of idiosyncratic factors about President Yoon. Like his status as a political outsider, political inexperience. He was a prosecutor for a long time before coming in as a conservative candidate, et cetera, that those things did have some, say in the way that the martial law specifically manifested. But the risk of this kind of a systems level crisis was in some ways already baked in from the start from South Korea's nationally divided democratic roots. So you might be thinking at this point, well, it's still a democracy, right? So these illiberal misbehaving political elites can only really do this as long as voters actually own it and still vote for them. So we wanted to test, are voters actually more willing to forego democratic principles in context of high nationalist polarization? And so we ran this experiment a couple years ago during kind of right after the peak of COVID in South Korea. And this posed actually a really great natural setting to look at these trade-offs, because this is when a lot of the small businesses and even citizens started to actually protest against these sort of, really austere compliance measures that helped South Korea be quite successful in containing COVID. But this was we ran this right at that as that public discontent was growing. And a lot of that debate was about trade-offs between national welfare and security with things like democratic values, privacy, right to free enterprise, things like that. So we ran this survey in that context. And I should say, during this context, it was the left administration that was in power. I know maybe some of you can read this, but most of you cannot. But I just wanted to show you what the actual original wording was. So 3 groups. The control group got to meet hypothetical Mr. Kim candidate for the left party in the upcoming legislative elections. Mr. Kim is a small business owner and a family guy, and is running on the platform of the problem is unemployment, and the answer is, better development, right? So pretty likable guy, nothing to really protest. Now, if you were in treatment 1, and most people in South Korea do these surveys on their mobile phone, so you would swipe left. So if you swiped left and you're in treatment 1, you then learned this factoid about Mr. Kim. Mr. Kim has said that groups and individuals that are critical of the government's COVID policies should be punished. Okay? So kind of a very clearly illiberal stance. Citizens have the responsibility to unconditionally obey the government. Clearly not very liberal democracy, and that he said that in an interview. And these are the actual graphics that went with it. So it was like trying to maximize the effect here. If you were in the second group, you swiped once more, and then you saw sort of a justification for that position, right? And in that interview, he says, in circumstances of national threat, even in a democracy, freedom of expression is not absolute. Right? And that statement is actually taken almost verbatim from a statement made by the Minister of Foreign Affairs during this time. Okay. And so obviously the expectation here is that people generally, hopefully like Mr. Kim, kind of go like, ugh, what's this? But that this justification actually brings them back, right? That was sort of our expectation going in to see how that varies. So I have both good news and bad news. I'll start with the left. In general, people like Mr. Kim, and we're very willing to punish and say, I'm no longer willing to vote for this guy when we showed them the illiberal stance, right? But then when we gave them the nationalist justification, it's not statistically significant, but you see this sort of bump of a gain of about a third back, right? What's actually more interesting is when you break this down by party. So remember, the candidate here is a leftist candidate. So the liberals, the dark bar, are co-partisans with this candidate. And when you focus just on that group, you see sort of that average effect mirrored here, right? Very supportive and willing to vote for Mr. Kim, dips down here, but then recovers here. What's interesting about this one is the level at which it recovers. It recovers right over that 0.5 line, meaning that after all of that, when you give the nationalist justification, liberal partisans are still more willing to vote for Mr. Kim than not. Here's the conservative, right? Here, the lightest bar on the right side. Don't like him to start. Really don't like him after the illiberal treatment. And then what? Are not at all responsive to the nationalist justification treatment. In fact, they turn even more negative when you give them that. And we argue here that if you know enough about the context of South Korean politics, that this is sort of an awareness among conservatives of, I don't agree with the vision of the nation that you are trying to protect, or the understanding of welfare of national welfare that you are trying to. So
just a clarification, so the treatment 2 group already got treatment 1. Okay.
Yeah. So I want to sort of end here and leave enough room for discussion. The Jerry Maguire fans in the rooms, break down or break through. I've struggled with this a lot. I had to write a recent annual review piece on, and I ended up South Korean democracy at a crossroads, because I do think that as sort of devastating as the current politics are, that when you hit sort of that kind of system level rock bottom, that it actually does clear the foundation for something new. Perhaps the biggest silver lining that has come out of South Korea's martial law crisis is really the political galvanization of youth. This is the generation that we refer to as the born democratic generation. The older generation either lived through authoritarian rule themselves, or are part of the democracy movement generation where, South Korea, especially in the elite social circles, is very small. Know of a friend or a friend of a friend or a colleague who either took part in the democracy protests as a college student, was then imprisoned and tortured because of it, or actually perished. So they viscerally know what the martial law thing means. But the young generation, this was all very abstract until this happened. And for that very brief 6 hours, got a taste for what it might be like to actually lose democracy. And this is, typically the generation across really everywhere that is typically more politically disengaged and apathetic, and has really, if you look at the demographic profile of protesters calling for Yoon's impeachment, they are distinctly younger and actually also more female, because he had run on a pretty misogynistic presidential campaign when he got elected. So the bringing in of that electorate is meaningful, not just because they're a new batch of voters, but actually, in my mind, they actually comprise a new electorate. These young voters are a distinct sort of generational shift away from the older Cold War national identity issues that are still consume partisan elites in South Korea. When you survey these young voters, they tend to conceive of their identity strictly only in South Korean terms. They're not really thinking about things like reunification. They say, when you ask them, should we reunify? because we're co-nationals is actually a declining factor among this generation. So they don't really identify with the set of identity issues on which the political parties, the mainstream political parties are polarized on. What they do care about is things like, I can't afford an apartment. And in South Korean culture, there's still, the man is supposed to provide the housing when you get married. And so that becomes a reason why certain marriages fall apart. Intense competition and a hyper-educated electorate can't find enough jobs, even if you go to a four-year college after that intense educational system. So these voters think about their national identity within South Korean terms and care about these more domestic bread and butter issues. And neither party has really done a great job capturing this new electorate. And when you look at, historical precedents of big partisan shifts or partisan alignments, right, it's usually when you have sort of a big socioeconomic or demographic change. And I think that, this isn't just it's an age cohort life cycle story. It's actually, to me, these are a new electorate and can actually provide that electoral constraint to push both parties to then enact the kinds of institutional reforms that are needed. Hopefully what this talk has demonstrated is that this isn't an issue that is solvable by a single partisan turnover. I think that it's really important to temper that kind of optimism and maybe even naivete with the reality of what actually caused this break in South Korean democracy. Some fundamental institutional reforms need to be geared toward defanging the pressures of nationalist polarization, especially for rank and file party members. That might mean things like, to start, South Korea has a single presidency system that probably needs, if you make that into two-term presidencies, it creates a lot more moral hazard, or it decreases the moral hazard to just come in for your one term and do radical reforms of the state identity because you have a longer term horizon where you're gonna have to go back to the voters, right? So it gives actual real incentive to diversify at least the policy platform of the party. South Korean party systems also don't have open primaries in the way that politics does. Party leadership is kind of an insider behind the scenes insider game. That gives tremendous leverage, as you can imagine, to senior members of the party. And so it's really hard for rank and file members to kind of go against the grain or say, that we should really step away from all of this illiberal partisan competition. But if you give voters a little bit more of a direct say in how party leadership and ballots are constructed, then that gives, I think, more room at least for newer kinds of leadership to emerge. And then the third thing is really, and this sometimes is kind of brushed off as window dressing, but it's what my entire research is about, that this idea of trying to construct a truly sort of unifying national identity for South Korea, I think is really important. And I think that, this younger generation, as well as sort of cultural entrepreneurs, the sort of opportunity is there, right, to do this. And I think it's really important for the government to actually invest in various efforts in civil society, in the sort of cultural sector of South Korea, which is, as you know, is, extremely powerful to be sort of the next generation leader here in coming up and reimagining Korean national identity and kind of yanking it out of the shadows of the Cold War. So I'm cautiously optimistic for South Korea as a democracy. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Aram. I know you're open to questions from the audience, so please raise your hand. I'll let you just field the questions and hopefully people will maybe there's a little bit of comment, but mostly ask a question.
Yep, back.
Hi, Chapel Lawson. Thank you. I love the Jerry Maguire reference, and we've dated ourselves by my mention of that. So, two things. First is what is really distinctive about the South Korean voter experience here, and then the larger story about South Korean democratization. From an outsider, knowing about voting behavior, but much less about South Korea. It just seems like your voters are behaving more or less like voters everywhere. You know, they're responsive to priming and low stakes survey experiments. You know, there's some cohort replacement and that changes their attitudes. They mainly focus on valence issues like the economy. They respond to top-down partisan cues based on their inherent political identities. I mean, it all feels very familiar. But then when I think about what is distinctive about the South Korean experience, you're telling me a different story about South Korean democratization than the one I'm familiar with. And I'm sure that you're right, because I'm sure you know the case much better. But my memory, again, from the voters' perspective, is that the main cleavages at the beginning were regionalism. And that regional background predicted 80 to 85% of your voting preference in the first couple elections. And that issues about North Korea were, you know, they were more there maybe than in foreign policy than many other countries, but still relatively low on the list. And this national cleavage, or sort of big stakes ideological thing, was always subordinate to questions about economic performance and region. And then in the recent elections, these issues were sort of subordinate both to ideology, to longstanding partisan cues independent of ideology, and then to this new set of cultural and globalization issues, including role of women in society. So again, not so much about the existential debate over nationhood and national identity, but more typical voter issues. So tell me why I'm wrong, because again, I'm sure I'm wrong. I just have a different memory of the democratization experience in South Korea.
So actually, the national cleavage that I talked about is really intimately linked to the regional.
To which? Sorry.
The regional cleavage. So in sort of the early electoral studies of South Korean politics, the regional cleavage is usually characterized as, you know, one side got a lot of the economic goodies during the developmental era, the other side didn't because of where Park Jong-un was from, and that created these regional animosities. What's typically missing from that stories is that the side that didn't get the economic goodies, you know, that was also the site, sort of the central site of the pro-democracy movement, and where a lot of the national dissidents ended up organizing and living and networking. And so, you know, this national cleavage has always existed, but it was very kind of, I don't know if taboo is the right word, but because during the authoritarian era, sort of a singular version of that was so dominant, it was kind of politically taboo to sort of openly embrace this. You know, I see this to be kind of a parallel to actually a lot of parallels with American politics, where from the very beginning there were sort of two distinct visions for what America should be. Fought a civil war over it. One side won, and the side that lost, right, became that narrative kind of went underground, or at least became sort of taboo to openly embrace until recently it's sort of come back. And so to say that, hey, you know, it's all about regionalism would be for me, in my mind, for somebody to look at American politics as an outsider and say, well, isn't it all about the North versus South divide and how, you know, economic policies made the North more prosperous after the Civil War, whereas the South had to deal with sort of the after effects of the abolition. Those things are, you know, the region in American politics is also intimately tied, right, to these contested nations of nationhood. So that's how it relates to region. In fact, I just discussed a paper yesterday on the endurance of the regional cleavage. And in fact, in that paper, and I believe the empirical analysis, what they find is actually the region effect goes away once you plug in political ideology, like the left and right, right? And so, you know, what does regionalism actually capture? I think that there's much more depth there that actually intersects with the national cleavage story rather than supplants it in South Korean history. You know, the women issue is becoming a real issue. Partly because of sort of, you know, what another sociologist describes as sort of compressed modernity. You know, the rapid pace at which South Korea had to go from traditional to the modern and retained aspects of the traditional, that shedding process didn't have enough time. But also because the conservatives actively used gender as an electoral strategy in the last presidential election. Precisely because I think they knew enough that, hey, this is not, you know, this is not just more voters, but it's like, you know, the other party hasn't gotten a monopoly over the young voters either. We're going to get all the young men, right? So the young men heavily gravitate towards the conservatives for now, but I really think that is more sort of temporal electoral strategy at this point than sort of enduring campaign platforms geared towards gender. So that one, I think it's a little bit too early to tell how that's going to help with sort of this partisan shift away from the identity issues. But I totally buy your point about, is it really the reunification stuff, like especially the younger generation doesn't really identify with this. So we're about to actually field another experiment to see essentially when party leaders violate that core identity policy versus if they violate some other kind of peripheral issue like LGBTQ or migration, whether or not voters respond differently.
I was wondering if you could talk about the role of the Army and the security institutions in actually not executing the martial law, and how going forwards those may either play into the partisan competition or put a lid on it.
Yeah, that's a question. And I don't have like a clear-cut answer because I'm struggling through it myself, and I don't know enough about the higher level of the military to know, you know, exactly where those orders like how it originated and how it was passed down. I will say that I think what it exposed, actually in my book, I look at military duty in South Korea and how it's almost sort of a level of a national idiom in Korea that you're not a real Korean man until you do your military service. And so this idea of state supportive citizenship or state sacrificial citizenship was always intimately tied to being a real and good member of the Korean nation. I think as the left has really risen and this national cleavage that had always existed before but was so dominated by one side, it was hard to see the effects of it. As that has really come up to the fore of South Korean politics, I think we're getting a situation where within a single state, there's sort of, you know, bifurcated ideas of nationhood, even at the citizen level. Now, what that does is it produces phenomena like, you know, when the other side wins the presidency, Facebook profiles of not my president. Or things like when the military acts a certain way, you're not sure actually whose national interest the military is actually protecting it. It sows a lot of doubt, and it weakens sort of that identity basis for compliance with the state. And I think what we saw in the anecdotal stories of, you know, these are like young soldiers, right? Just doing their conscription duty, who are then called. In fact, the story is that they thought that they were going on a special mission. And so they were packed to do that, and then they got sent to the national parliament. I think that actually captures and exposes that kind of a rift in that young generation. And I think it actually shows that these fractures are much deeper than just what we witness at the top level with this martial law decree. Not in a, hey, like we care about North Korea or not kind of way, but in a fundamental fracture with, you know, who does the state actually represent the best interests of people like me? Or, you know, what I think of what it means to be a Korean, that there's a growing schism there. And that's why the young soldiers were like, I'm not going to shoot. So I think that was probably should be a wake-up call, given the ongoing security issue. I mean, the armistice is still, you know, yeah, those are my thoughts.
Thank you very much. I learned a lot, even as a real Korean man who is on the service in Korea. So you identify the nationalism or nationalistic vision to define the state as a potential source, you know, for this the perception about the existential threat that both parties have. I wonder whether a constitutional institution, political institution in general, could be an alternative source for those, in that you have very strong presidential power. And the winner takes all type of the majoritarian, electoral institutions. So if you look at those institutional features, then that could be identified as also a potential source for existential threat for these opposition parties.
Yeah.
So I wonder, how can we really distinguish the nationalistic origin for this versus the institutional origin?
Yeah.
Because if we can extend the single term presidential term to the double dual term, as you suggested, then I think that it will arguably strengthen or at least lengthen the period, which probably will cause
more damage.
More damage, given your argument. So just could you?
So it's all in the details, right? These institutional reforms are only going to do what they're intended to do if they're actually passed with bipartisan support. In fact, the reason why South Korea has a single-term presidency, right, is because in the democratization process, the opposition really fought for that because they were so scared that the authoritarian successor party was going to essentially stay in power forever. And so that was actually a security mechanism that was initially placed as a compromise in democratization. So, is this basically an institutional story? I don't think so. Not all places that don't have majoritarian rule and strong executives experience this kind of breakdown. And if you look at the history of how these institutional compromises were made, clearly they were made with the pre-existing national doubts and insecurities by the opposition that these types of institutional mechanisms would help more frequent partisan turnover. At this point, I think that now with the left actually having risen as a more serious challenger to the right, I think it's, the moment has come where those institutional safeguards have kind of run their course and are now actually producing sort of one-term presidencies that have a lot of symbolic nationalist agendas with not enough room or incentive to actually look at the bread and butter domestic things that voters care about. So that gap again of responsiveness is really failing. And so again, I not to put it all on the young people, but I really do think that the younger electorate holds a lot more sway in getting both parties to really kind of refashion themselves and reappeal their core platforms toward away from these nationalist polarization and more towards typical polarization on things like big or small government or things like that kind of take national unity as a background condition.
We have time for one more question.
Trying to make it a good one. Thank you for this, really enlightening. I'm curious, younger voters, I guess, in our country and other countries who may be disconnected from government, sort of day-to-day operations, like South Korea here, it's not really a national identity thing. We've been around for a while. They sort of vote rarely, but vote on different preferences. I'm wondering, though, if the government doesn't play a huge role in the lives of this potential new electorate until very recently when they started protesting the streets. How much influence do some of the mega corporations, your Samsungs, SKs, et cetera, the entities that might have more influence or presence in the daily lives of younger voters? I mean, have they wielded that influence through South Korea's democratic history at all? Could we expect that they could try to start doing that? And if this sort of field becomes a little bit more open and people are disaffected with the way that the left and the right have been operating for these.
Interesting. The big conglomerates have typically sided with the right because they've received a lot of help from the right to become the big chaebols that they are today, and have come under really severe fire from the left administration in terms of various corruption investigations and sort of devolving power away from the center family lineages of these companies. this is not really going to answer your question, but hopefully provides a different perspective to it. So the young generation right now that's out on the streets, what I didn't get to tell about them is that they are the generation that when they were high schoolers, lived through the formative experience of the Seoul Ferry incident, which was an incident where a ferry carrying 200 plus high school students on a school field trip sunk, and almost nearly everyone died. And there was a lot of talk about corruption and sort of, not having clear chain of command and trying to shield certain businesses from responsibility for that performance failure by the sitting president, who was Park Geun-hye. And then these high schoolers grow up and, go to college and start to live their young adult lives. And then they're again hit by the Itaewon crowd crush tragedy. Freak accident, right? But then in the aftermath of it, again, a lot of talk about, failure of the state to deploy enough police in that area, even though they knew that it was going to be it was during Halloween, right? During a high attendance area, because they had diverted that police for something else. That was again under Yoon, another conservative president. And so the state has actually been pretty present in the lives of this new generation, but not exactly, I think, in the way that the state wants to be, right? And so I think this generation is eager to have more of a positive connection and interaction with the state, a state that has repeatedly failed them in sort of formative life experiences growing up. And so I think the opportunity there is ripe for both parties, whether it's in conjunction with some of these big conglomerates, or there's also like a really vibrantly growing sort of small business entrepreneurship sector in the South Korean economy. And they kind of position themselves as the anti-Chaebol. And they've gotten actually a lot of incentive and help from the left in terms of actual real funding investments, of promoting these types of entrepreneurship companies on a more global scale. And so I do think that that landscape will become more dispersed over time, such that they can actually play more of a diversifying role in South Korean politics, rather than sort of the status quo enforcing role that conglomerates typically have played.